Okay, so now we're going to look at issues with the deprivation account. Basically, sort of problems around the edges that need fixing, and a disagreement between Ben Bradley, who we talked about last time, and Jeff McMahan, who you might remember from his theory on personal identity. So, what we're not going to talk about that we talked about last time is the theories on the time that death harms you. Both McMahan doesn't explicitly say, but he appears to be a subsequentist, like Bradley. That is, he says that death is a harm to you when you're dead. We're not going to get into that again. In the article, Death and the Value of Life, McMahan does a couple of things. The first thing he does is he tries to work out a reconciliation strategy with Epicurus. So he says what we like about Epicurus's argument is it says that death is not a harm to us. That would be nice if it was true. However, it also appears to have odd implications, such as killing is not wrong because you're not harming someone if you kill them. And you can't talk about suicide being rational or irrational, because for suicide to be rational, it would have to be that suicide is in your interest. But if Epicurus is right, if you don't exist, nothing is in your interest, so you can't talk about a good suicide, like, suicide because you're in constant pain and you just want to end it, or a bad suicide, you've broken up with somebody and you're momentarily depressed and you decide to commit suicide. So the common sense view is that some suicides can be rational and some are not, but if Epicurus is right, it seems to have the implication that you can't say that about suicide, that you can't make that distinction. So what McMahan tries to do in the first part of the article is try to preserve the idea that death is not a harm to us, because we like that part of Epicurus, while making that consistent with common sense intuitions like killing is wrong and suicide can be rational or irrational. And that's all the stuff about the comparative view and so on. I don't want to get too much into that, but there's a couple of passages on 37 and 38 that he says. The comparative view says, in order for something to be good or bad, there must be a relevant alternative that is in some sense worse, or there must be a relevant alternative to compare it with. Whereas if Epicurus is right about the existence condition, that is, nothing can be in your interest if you don't exist, then there is no relevant comparison when you're dead. What he says is that we just need to drop the comparative view. He says, and if we drop the comparative view, this gives us the result that it allows us to reject the idea that never existing can be bad or worse for a person, because that's a weird implication, while accepting that to come to exist can be good for a person. And if we allow that coming to exist can be good for a person, this allows us to suggest that killing is bad and things like that. We can say that coming to exist can be good, even though it is not better than never existing. So that's the weird part. That's what you get from rejecting the comparative view. You are allowed to say that coming to exist is good, but you can't say that it's better than not existing. That would be a bad implication of your view if you said that coming to exist was better than not existing, because that would appear to impose on us a duty to bring as many people into existence as possible. We should take all of the frozen embryos out of the freezers and make sure that they become people, because then we're doing good. He ends up by saying, suppose we accept that coming to live can be good for a person, even if death would not be bad for them. That's the reconciliation with the Epicurean view. We could then claim that death would be bad, not bad for the person who dies, because Epicurus is right, presumably, on this view, but bad in a quasi-impersonal way. It would be bad because it would exclude what would be good for a person, namely continuing to exist. This on page 38. Now, that's kind of interesting, but I don't really want to get into that. The stuff I want to get into is the second section where he talks about the badness of death. And he considers, here he's sort of criticizing something said by Nagel. Now, as we know, all of these guys have to talk about Epicurus. Epicurus is pretty much a contemporary of Aristotle in ancient Greece, and he gives this famous argument that death is not a harm to the person who dies. And then there's kind of a lull in the philosophy of death for, pretty much 2,000 years until the guy who really kicked off the modern debate about it is Thomas Nagel. In this amazing collection of essays he published in the 70s called Mortal Questions. This contains just one classic essay after another. For example, if you do philosophy of mind, you have to read Nagel's essay, which is also in this book, called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he wrote one on the meaning of life called The Absurd. It's just amazing. Every other philosopher is kind of envious that Nagel wrote this book. It's like an album that's full of hit singles. And one of these is his discussion of death, where he criticizes Epicurus and gives a kind of version of the deprivation account. It doesn't talk about possible worlds in the way that Fred Feldman does, and I think Fred Feldman's view is much more clearly expressed. But one of the things I find actually Nagel, a lot of times Nagel writes a beautiful sentence, but his essays can be kind of impenetrable, as you probably remember if you tried to read chapters from The View from Nowhere, which is another book that he wrote. He is not the clearest of writers. But one thing he suggests in this essay on death is that death deprives us, so that's the basic insight of the deprivation alternative to Epicurus. But he seems to suggest that deprivation what death deprives us of is pretty much infinite. That is, death, the fact that we are mortal is a misfortune to us. Even if you live to the outermost extreme of human possibility, like if you're the longest lived person ever, your death still deprives you of stuff, on Nagel's view. And McMahan quotes him as saying, death, no matter how inevitable, is an abrupt cancellation of indefinitely extensive possible goods. If there is no limit to the amount of life that it would have been good to have, then it may be that a bad end is in store for us all, no matter how long we live. Methuselah was still deprived by his death. That's what McMahan is taking on in this second section of his article, The Badness of Death. And he says, against Nagel, in the section, What Death Deprives Us Of, what is relevant in evaluating the badness of an individual's death is not what might have happened if he had not died, not what might have happened if he had not died. Because if that's what you're looking at, then, whenever you die, you can still say, well, what if you hadn't died and you'd lived more? So however long you live, your life will be a misfortune because there could have been more if you had not died. So that's not what is relevant to working out the badness of your death. What is what would in fact have happened. The relevant alternative to death for purposes of comparison is not continuing to live indefinitely or forever, but living on for a limited period of time and then dying of some other cause. So in other words, what McMahan is saying is that if we want to work out how bad our death is for us, we must compare it, we must look in the context of us being, basic biological entities who are mortal. So what this implies is that if you are the longest lived person ever, essentially your death isn't really bad at all. Maybe you could have lived a couple of minutes longer. Well, in that case, that's how bad your death is, a couple of minutes worth of deprivation. Whereas early death, on this view, appears to be bad because you are deprived of a lot. If, for example, a kid gets killed just crossing the road, that's very bad because presumably they might have been able to live live into their late 80s or more. Now, if you're going to say that, which remember sounds a lot like Bradley. Bradley would say that. Bradley would say how bad your death is determined by exactly how long you would have continued to have a life worth living. In one of his graphs, as long as the life that you would have had is in the positive axis of well-being, of value. If you dip below into negative, that means that your life is bad for you, you're suffering, and it would be better for you to die. So we work out how bad your death is, according to Bradley, by seeing how long you would have had positive value in your life. So McMahan sounds a lot like Bradley, but McMahan brings up all kinds of complications. And the most important of these is the problem of specifying the antecedent. Now, the antecedent first of all, what is an antecedent? If you haven't taken logic, you don't know this, and if you have, you've probably forgotten. The antecedent is what comes between the if and the then in an if-then statement. So, for example, an if-then statement, or what we call a conditional or hypothetical statement, is if something, then something else. What is the antecedent that we're interested in working out how much you suffered? According to Nagel, it's for some guy who dies, we ask, if he had not died, then, this is how much value he would have. This is the wrong antecedent, according to what McMahan has just said. Okay, so what is the right antecedent? And I haven't listed it in the list of examples here, but he starts out by talking about a guy, Mort, who dies of cancer. Now, when we say someone dies of cancer, we're talking loosely, because if somebody is a pathologist who has to write up the death report on that person, they don't say cause of death cancer, they say the specific medical event that killed him in the end, like a hemorrhage or something like that. Now, they would say that why did he get these hemorrhages? Because of, what cancer had done to his body. But the thing that actually finished him is the hemorrhage. Now, but which do we say? Do we say, in order to work out how bad Mort's death is for him, do we say, if he had not had cancer, then we work out how long he would live? And again, the way we work out how long he had lived is we imagine these things called possible worlds. We look in the nearest possible world, which is the nearest parallel universe, in which somebody exactly like Mort lives, except for one relevant difference, which is, well, what is the relevant difference we're looking for? Is it that he doesn't have the hemorrhage? If it's that he doesn't have the hemorrhage, then probably, given that his body is riddled with cancer, he's not going to live much longer anyway. It's going to be something else, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. So if the thing we focus on, if the antecedent that we focus on is if he had not had that hemorrhage, then it's going to turn out that Mort's death is not very tragic, because if he had not had that hemorrhage, then in the nearest possible world where he doesn't have that hemorrhage, but everything else is similar, because his body is riddled with cancer, he only lives like a couple of days. So how bad is Mort's death? If that's what we focus on, a couple of days. Not bad at all, really. But if, on the other hand, we focus on him having cancer, and we imagine Mort without cancer, well, then maybe he could have lived on for decades. So depending on what we fixate on as the thing that killed him, that will affect the result of how bad his death is. And there's a bunch of cases that kind of illustrate this issue. So, for example, let's talk about Joe and Schmo. Joe is 29 and a half, Schmo is 30. And they both get run over by a bus. Whose death is worse? Well, it looks like Joe's by half a year because he's 29 and a half and Schmo is 30. So it looks like they're pretty equal, but maybe Joe's is worse. But then, when they do the autopsy, they discover that Joe had a silent, symptomless, but invariably fatal disease that was going to kill him soon. He just didn't know it. Given that we found that out, it looks like Schmo's death is now a lot worse because it looks like the relevant antecedent for Joe is, if we use the same antecedent for both of them, and we say, if he had not been killed by a bus, how long would Joe have lived? Not long, because he had this disease. If he had not been killed by a bus, how long would Schmo have lived? A lot longer, because he was otherwise healthy. So it looks like if we focus on the same antecedent for both of them, Joe's life is not very tragic, Schmo's is. Now, is that the right result, says McMahan? Well, maybe, that seems intuitive, but then he says, imagine if you ask Joe's mother. Imagine if, he imagines this case. So Joe's mother is all upset because her son has been run over by a bus. And then the pathologist says, hey, good news, your son's death wasn't tragic after all, because look, he had this fatal disease. He was going to die anyway. So, his death is only a few days worth of tragic. Isn't that great news that we've discovered this fact that would have killed him otherwise? His mom is not going to take that as consolation. She is not going to see his death as any less tragic. Is she wrong not to see it as less tragic? That's the interesting question. All right. Another case is the cavalry officer. This is in the Crimean War, which is a largely forgotten war, except Florence Nightingale did her business during the Crimean War. I don't know if Florence Nightingale is as famous in America as she is in Britain. She's one of the first nurses. She basically invented in England the profession of nursing as an independent profession, and she's known as the lady with the lamp for some reason. I don't really know. Look her up on Wikipedia. But anyway, the Crimean War was the Brits were in Crimea, which is back in the news since 2014, since Putin annexed it, and it was a bloody and brutal conflict. I think the Brits came out of that pretty poorly. Okay, so the cavalry officer is this British cavalry officer, and he gets shot by a Russian soldier. He gets shot by Ivan. What is the correct antecedent by which to work out how tragic his death is? If he had not been hit by Ivan's bullet, then it turns out that his death is not tragic at all, because it turns out that another Russian soldier, Boris, had him in his sights and would have shot him a few seconds later. So if the antecedent we fixate on is if he had not been killed by that bullet, then his death wasn't tragic at all, because this other cause would have killed him seconds later. But that doesn't really seem like the right result. We want to say that his death is tragic. We want to say he was cut off in his prime. And we want to say, surely the tragedy of his death extends at least up to when he's 80 or something like that, or whatever the average life expectancy for a British man was in that part of the 19th century. So, to solve that issue, because it looks like currently the correct thing to say is if we fixate on the cause of his death as the antecedent, the cause of this cavalry officer's death is clearly Ivan's bullet. But if we fixate on that, it ends up giving us the result that his death is not tragic. And that doesn't seem right. So what McMahan suggests is that we should, instead of focusing on the specific cause of the death, we should look at the transitive cause of his death. And this is defined on page 47 under the section of proposal. Let us define the transitive cause of an event E as follows. If C is the immediate or proximate cause of E, so E is the death, C is Ivan's bullet in this case, because it's the immediate or proximate cause of E, then the transitive cause of E is the set of all the events that form part of the chain of causes leading to C. Now, why does that make the cavalry officer's death more tragic? Because, he says, in this case, once we look into what caused Ivan's bullet, the real answer is the Crimean War. Ivan wouldn't have been there shooting at this guy, and this guy wouldn't have been in Crimea. He would have been safe at home in Ealing, sipping a cup of tea or something. So what really caused Ivan's bullet in the big picture, the transitive cause, is the Crimean War. So that suggests that the correct antecedent to look at in specifying how tragic this guy's, the young cavalry officer's death is the Crimean War. So if we say, if the Crimean War had not have happened, well, then it looks like he would have lived to a ripe old age. So that gives us the result we want. Let's see. So he says, and if you want the proposal in full, you know, X's and Y's, as philosophers love to give in their definitions, it's on page 48. It says, applied to the cases. Cavalry officer, it's the Crimean War, so his death is tragic. Now, with Joe and Schmo, because there's no connection between Joe's invisible disease and the bus, then Joe's invisible disease is not part of the transitive cause, so that doesn't get removed. So it turns out, on this new proposal, Schmo's death is tragic because, you know, the bus, if not for the bus, he would have lived to a ripe old age. But Joe's life, because the disease has nothing to do with the bus, once we look at the nearby world in which the bus didn't happen, Joe still has the disease, so he's going to die soon. So it turns out, under McMahan's proposal, Joe's death is still not tragic. Mort's death, remember him, we removed the cancer rather than just the hemorrhage, because the cause of part of the transitive cause of his death, the immediate cause of his death, is the hemorrhage, but that wouldn't have happened if he hadn't had cancer. So the relevant transitive cause is the cancer. So then the antecedent for Mort is if he had not had cancer, and his death turns out to be tragic because he would have lived a long time. Then we again return to Joe's mother's view of it, and she say the proper object of her grief is the bus that killed him plus the disease. She wants to imagine what had happened if neither of those things had happened. Why are we looking at Jerry? Well, Jerry dies of extreme old age at the biological limits of human life. It looks like most of us would say his life isn't really that tragic. People say, certainly in England, they said he had a good innings when somebody died, like the Queen. She had a good innings, that's for sure. I don't feel that sorry, you know, as people kind of making fun of the Queen's death, you know, had headlines like, woman dies tragically in her late 90s. The joke is, that's really kind of to be expected. When you're in your late 90s, you're going to die soon, and it's not that big of a deal. That's part of what it is to be human. So that's like Jerry. Jerry's going to die soon anyway. It's not that tragic. Bradley might even say it's good for them because they're likely to suffer fairly soon anyway. Given when you're very old, things start to break down and it's painful just to get up in the morning. Okay, so Jerry's death is not that tragic. But we want to say, isn't there an important difference between Jerry and Joe? I mean, both of them, they're going to die soon anyway, if not for the thing that caused them. Don't we believe that Joe's death is more pitiable than Jerry's? And then he says, even if we add all kinds of circumstances, he says, like, even if we imagine 20 Murder Inc. hitmen independently trying to kill Joe, we would still pity Joe more. So it seems like the account we've given that suggests that Joe is not tragic because the transitive cause is the bus is still not a satisfying answer that gives us the answer we want of how to work out how bad Joe's death is. The suggestion here is that Jerry has had his fair share. That's why we don't pity him. So what McMahan is saying is, yes, we pity Joe more, but really his death is just as not very bad for him as Jerry's was. It's just that it is appropriate to pity Joe more. And then he talks about, because you don't pity Jerry because he's had his fair share of life. Feelings such as pity have to be adjusted to normal or reasonable expectations. Consider someone who badly wants to travel to distant parts of the universe. The fact that his desire is frustrated does not evoke pity. This is because pity is appropriate only in cases in which a person is unable to fulfill reasonable expectations given the circumstances of human life. Then he imagines Faust and Fred, or Faust and Fred. They're both old, but Faust, and again, they get run over by a bus. Clearly buses loom large in McMahon's imagination. He must be terrified when crossing the road. But Faust and Fred both get run over by a bus, and they're both old. But it turns out that Faust, as he famously does, has made a pact with the devil, and just before he gets run over, his body is rejuvenated to that of an 18-year-old. They both lived the same amount of time, but Faust can now expect a lot more life because he's got this rejuvenated body. Neither has gained more life than the other. So we would say, like Jerry, they're both in the same position as Jerry. They've had a fair innings. But shouldn't we pity Faust more because he's lost more? Well, see what you think about his discussion. More interesting, I think, is Jeanette, because Jeanette is a young woman who dies of a genetic condition that is both strongly incurable and essential to her identity. That is, because it's genetic, it's part of what makes her her. In other words, you cannot imagine a close possible world in which she doesn't have this condition, because if she doesn't have this condition in that close possible world, it's not her. This condition is in some sense essential to her. So every possible world in which she exists, she has this genetic condition. If there's someone that looks like her in a nearby possible world that doesn't have it, it's not her. Then it looks like there is no possible world that exists where she exists without it, so her death isn't that tragic. Dying at a young age is just what's natural for her. What do we say about Jeanette? Yeah, so it seems like Jeanette's death, we have to say it's not that tragic. He gives some possible responses. He sort of gestures at possible responses. Jeanette's death is not a misfortune because she had the longest life that she could have had. That seems to be what his view implies. An alternative would be to say, even though no possible versions of her could have a better life, her life is a misfortune because her counterpart has a better life. I don't want to get into that. That seems like just trying to dodge the issue. If somebody like you could have lived longer, doesn't mean that you could have lived longer. and then he says we'll deviate from the proposal a little bit to deal with Jeanette. But it seems like, on his view, Jeanette is a bit of a counterintuitive response. It seems like because of her genetic condition, we have to say that her death is not that tragic because she's pretty much at the end of her natural life. It's just that her natural life, because of the way she is shorter than other people's. But what we would want to say is, isn't that a tragedy in itself, that her natural life is shorter than other people's, and his view can't really account for that. Okay. The interesting part of this that he develops in a lot more detail in the book, but and I gave you sections from the book to read earlier in the semester. He doesn't really go into much detail, but he goes into enough for you to understand Bradley's criticisms. And this is the degree of psychological connectedness. So actually, I'll use Bradley's graphs to illustrate McMahan's account. So, one of the problems that remains, I'll get back to the baby treatment kills at 35 after we've gone through these criticisms. One of the problems that remains with the revised relative goods account, isn't that what he calls his view? Yes, the revised possible goods account. The revised possible goods account, as specified so far in McMahan's article, is we work out how bad your death is by looking at what you could have possibly had you not died. Now, could have possibly, what works out the limits of those depends on this discussion of what's the relevant thing that we focus on that killed you. And, if it's the bullet, then your life is not your death is not that tragic. If it's the Crimean War, then your death is a lot more tragic. That discussion. But one implication of this view is that the earlier you die, the more tragic your death is, provided the alternative is that you live to the limits of your biological life, that you would have lived to a ripe old age, let's say. So what this seems to suggest is that if you die as a baby, so if you die here, then what you lose is everything under this graph until it hits this line. So everything under this graph from this moment on. You got this amount if you die as a baby, but what you lost is all of this. So that's a tragic death. You lost a lot. Whereas if you die as a student, your death, while tragic, is less tragic. It's less tragic by the distance between age 1 and, say, age 18. So that's all of this. So the death as a baby's death, is more tragic than student's death. And you might say, well, yes, we don't like it when babies die. But what about fetuses? What about fetuses? Normally, for example, now, science has discovered that a fairly large proportion of fertilized eggs just spontaneously abort, and we don't even know it. So obviously, women know when they've miscarried, but they might miscarry a lot more often than they know. It's just that the fertilized egg never implants or just dies spontaneously. It just happens a fairly significant amount of the time. Is this a huge tragedy, these spontaneous abortions? Well, it seems like the revised possible goods account says it is a huge tragedy, and in fact, if a fetus spontaneously aborts, it's much worse than, when Schmo is cut down at age 30 by a bus. But our intuition is that Schmo's death is much more tragic. In other words, we don't think that very early deaths are tragic. We do think, so our intuition is that students' death is more tragic than babies. How do we make sense of this? Well, McMahan's suggestion is the time relative interest account. And you might remember this from the earlier reading where he says that what we have prudential interest in depends on the extent of our psychological connection between, so do I have a prudential interest in my life when I'm retired, when I'm, in my mid-60s, let's say? I would say yes, because I've got a fairly strong connection between that person, I hope, will have very strong memories of me at my age. So there's a strong connection between me now and me then. And it works the other way. I mean, going backwards from future me remembers present me, but also present me has intentions that are carried out by future me. So it works in both directions, this psychological connection. This is all Parfittian, Derek Parfit's idea of relation R. So as Parfit pointed out, relation R can vary in degrees. So the further apart 2 points in a lifespan are, the less the degree of psychological connectedness declines. I mean, certainly as you get older, you forget things. So what he suggests, what McMahan suggests, is incorporating this idea with baby and student. So here, because baby has very few, well, put it this way. As you get older, your memories of being a baby grow less very quickly. So the connectedness between, so what is the connection, psychological connection that baby would have had with this future person that the thick line represents? The baby would have had decreasing psychological connections. And in fact, a fetus has practically no psychological connections with the life that is lost, because nobody remembers being a fetus, and in fact the fetus hasn't a developed brain, hasn't got the capacity to remember anything. So there's no psychological connection at all with an early fetus. So while somebody loses out this much when a fetus dies, we can say the fetus has no prudential, the fetus cannot regard that life as lost to it, because it doesn't have the relevant psychological connection to claim that loss. This loss happened to a potential person, but the fetus doesn't have the psychological connection with them. It's like if you found out that you would be your brain would be completely wiped, and then new personality and new memories plugged in, and then that person would have a great life. Do you think that some great life is coming to you? No, says Parfit and McMahan, because in order for a great life to be yours, there has to be the right psychological connection with it. And we've just said that that psychological connection is severed. So, in other words, once you discount losses according to degree of psychological connectedness, this pink line represents, this is a graph from Bradley's chapter, this pink line represents the total amount that you can say a baby can claim to have lost if they die here. And this green line, so everything from here under the green line is the loss to student. Everything from here under the pink line is the loss to baby. And student loses more than baby once we add this this weighting according to psychological connectedness. So we fixed a counterintuitive result of the revised possible goods account. The counterintuitive result was that death of baby or even fetus is a much bigger tragedy than death age 30 or death at age 18. And we want to say that's wrong. So we do want to say, the hard part is, we do want to say that the death of an 18-year-old is more tragic than the death of a 13-year-old. But we don't want to say that the death of a 18-month-old is more tragic than an 18-year-old. So in some sense, we want to say younger adult more tragic than older adult. But very young child is not more tragic than the younger adult. So how do we do that? We incorporate the fact that we have very poor psychological connections with early children and fetuses because their brains are not developing. So that's the intuitive idea of McMahan's. Bradley, and the other thing that McMahan applies this to and that Bradley mentions is this idea of the cure. Suppose you've got a fatal disease and you will die of it very shortly, but if you take this cure, you will die of it, say, in a couple of years. But if you take this cure now, it will instantly reboot your personality. So it's as if you're an entirely new person who doesn't have any memories of you, and it has a completely different personality. And that person will have a long, happy life. Should you take the cure? According to this account, according to the unaltered revised possible goods account, you should take the cure, because you just look at the life that the person will live, and they're going to live a long and happy life. Great. But according to the time relative interest account, you shouldn't take the cure, because the person living the long, happy life after you take the cure isn't you, and you die, in fact, 2 years earlier. Because if you don't take the cure, you're going to live a couple of years, whereas if you do take the cure, you instantly disappear. So it's as if you take the cure on the revised account, the time relative interest account, it's as if you're doing a favor to somebody else, because you're giving this rebooted version of you a good life, but you vanish earlier. So McMahan says it's intuitive that you shouldn't take the cure, and therefore that's another victory for his account, because his account says you shouldn't take the cure. Now Bradley is going to say, I think you should take the cure, because all that matters is the thick line. So what is Bradley's criticism of McMahan's account? Well, he says a major problem for McMahan's account is that it seems to matter, it seems to say that when money is stolen from you matters even if the effects are the same on you, and this shouldn't happen. So let's look at the trust fund. The trust fund is when Claire has money in a trust fund for Charlie, her kid, and basically that's all he's got to look forward to, because his life is pretty shitty up to this point. As you can see, it's pretty much low. And if he gets the trust fund money, his life is going to improve. But it turns out she spends it all. Now, the problem, according to Bradley, is McMahan's account says Charlie's not going to get the money anyway until this point. So he's never going to see the money until this point. But, so as far as Charlie's concerned, it shouldn't matter when Claire steals it. If Claire steals it here, it's just as bad as if she steals it here, because he's not seeing the money until this point. and he's expecting the money here, and if it's gone, it doesn't matter to him if it was stolen there, if it was stolen there, if it was stolen there, if it was stolen there. But according to McMahan's account, if it's stolen here, then it's not as big of a deal as if it's stolen here, because the psychological connection between the young Charlie and the Charlie who would get the money is very little. So this, if you steal from this, if Claire steals from Charlie here, the losses to Charlie are just this much. Whereas if Claire steals from Charlie here, the losses to Charlie, because there's a strong psychological connection between the Charlie that gets the money stolen from him and the Charlie here. There's this closer connection to them, so they lose a lot more. So in other words, McMahan's view implies that there's a huge moral difference between the money being stolen here and the money being stolen here, but there really isn't a difference. And therefore, McMahan's theory is problematic. He goes into excruciating detail of the various ways that McMahan might be able to wriggle out of this in the longest section, which is objections to the time relative interest account, TRIA. And it gets pretty technical. He says that the closest way that McMahan can do this is if he has a theory of well-being that is actualism about desire satisfaction. That is, what makes people well off is having the actual desires that they currently have satisfied, not the desires that they will have in the future, but the desires that they currently have. And he says that is about the only way you can make McMahan's account not have this result in the trust fund, but have the result that McMahan wants it to have in the cure case. So, for example, actualism about desire satisfaction has this kind of implication. He says, this is Bradley on page 141. I actually am a Yankees fan and do not care about hockey, but if I were to take the cure, I would become a hockey fan and would want the New York Rangers to win the Stanley Cup. So if I were to receive the cure, it would be intrinsically good for me if the Rangers won, but if I were to refuse, it would not be. And given that we should, on McMahan's view, we should prefer the actual desires that you have before the cure, then that makes sense, that you won't get what you want at the time if you do take the cure. And there are problems with this, but essentially, Bradley says his conclusion is baby's death is in fact worse than student's death. So Bradley wants the unaltered possible goods account. He says that's the right one. A baby's death is a lot worse than a student's death. All right. Now, why was it that McMahan wanted this? Well, first of all, it seems intuitive to us that a spontaneous abortion is not much worse, and in fact is much less important than the death of someone cut off at 18. So it seems like McMahan was trying to get his theory to match with our intuitions anyway. What is Bradley going to say, given that his account seems to imply that that the death of a fetus, that an abortion is a very tragic death? Is his account then an anti-abortion argument? No, says Bradley. Even though something like Bradley's argument is a famous anti-abortion argument by a guy called Don Marquis, who wrote an article in 1989, I think, Why Abortion is Immoral. Don Marquis made this argument. He said, what makes killing wrong is basically what you're depriving your victim of. And if you the younger you kill someone, you're depriving them of more, or he doesn't actually quantify it. He says you're depriving someone of a possible future. That is what makes killing wrong. And this is true when you kill a fetus, so abortion is wrong. So he starts from saying, what makes killing wrong in regular cases where we say it's wrong? It must be this. He sort of eliminates the alternatives. It must be depriving them of a future. Well, you're depriving a fetus of a future, so therefore abortion is wrong. It sounds like he could point to Bradley's account as backing him up. Bradley doesn't like this. Bradley is pro-choice. So how does he argue, even though the death of a fetus is worse than the death of, say, a 10-year-old on his account, why is abortion not wrong, whereas killing a 10-year-old is wrong? And he says, well, it's to do with the fact that the fetus is not a person yet. And it is not immoral to inflict a large harm on a non-person, whereas it is immoral to inflict a lesser harm on a person. He says something like this. If you want to get into the details, I press him on this in my interview that I did with him on YouTube that I gave you the transcript. But that's his account. Whereas what McMahan wants to say is that it's not as large a harm when a fetus dies. Okay, back to McMahan. I want the baby treatment kills at 35. He says there's an apparent paradox of his time-relative interest account, and it's this. A baby has a fatal illness. All these fatal illnesses, it's so depressing. A baby has a fatal illness that will kill it soon unless they take a cure, and the cure will get rid of this disease, but it will have this side effect that the person who takes it will inevitably die at age 35. Should they take the cure? Now, intuitively, we say, of course, because if they don't take the cure, this baby dies very soon, and they get a very short life. Whereas if they take the cure, they at least live until age 35. Obviously, they should take the cure. But it looks like his time-relative interest account says you shouldn't take the cure. Why does it appear to have that implication? Because remember, it says that the death at age 35 is a much worse death than death of a baby. So in taking the treatment, you inflict a worse death on the baby than if you don't give the treatment. If you don't give the treatment, it has a death that deprives it of not much. Whereas if you take the treatment, the death that they will have at age 35 is much more tragic. How does he get round that? Well, he makes a kind of interesting distinction. He says, sometimes it's better to have a worse death. This is a case in which it's better to have a worse death because in ensuring itself a worse death, the baby gets to live 35 years that it wouldn't have otherwise. It's true that dying at 35 is a worse death than dying as a baby, but to compensate, I guess, they get 35 years of life. So that's the interesting puzzle there. So there you go. Bradley says in the beginning of his book that he thinks the more simple a view is, the better it is. It's more likely to be true. So he doesn't like all of these additions that McMahan makes to the simple deprivation account. This adding the psychological connection stuff, he says, ruins it. But of course, the implication that means that he can't avoid the implication that the death of a baby is a much worse death than the death of a student, even though we would normally regard the death of a student as a greater tragedy than, say, a miscarriage. So he has to explain why this intuition is wrong, or why a worse death is somehow less tragic. The baby who gets the worst death, their death is less tragic than the student's death, which deprives the student of less on his account. So there you go, some disagreements within the deprivation account. And then, of course, there's Epicurus, who says it makes no sense to say that you're deprived. Remember, all this time, Bradley is assuming that when you're dead, you have a welfare level of 0, when his critics say, when you're dead, you don't have a welfare level of 0 any more than you have a beauty level of 0. When you don't exist, you don't have any level, even 0. So in order to make all of these calculations, Bradley is assuming all this time that you can assign a welfare level to dead people. And the main criticism of that is, well, does that mean that a brick has a welfare level of 0? Why not? Because it's just as responsive as a non-existent person. So do we want to say this brick is suffering by not being able to feel because it is deprived of feeling? That just makes no sense. So he has to make a distinction between a non-existent dead person and a brick. He has to explain why something that can't think or feel, which is a non-existent dead person, has a welfare level of 0, whereas something else that can't think or feel, a brick, doesn't have a welfare level of 0. And he tries to do that as well. All right, death. Fascinating stuff.